Tale of the Manticore. Bonus episode. It's been a while, but once again, it is time for Mail of the Manticore. According to lore, a manticore occasionally gets questions in their mailbox. There will be much answering in the minutes ahead. Hey, this is John. I'd like to thank you for all of your questions over this past season. I've selected around a dozen really good ones to discuss on the show. Let's get into it. The first question comes from Mike Foster. They ask, did you play solo RPGs prior to Tale of the Manticore? And if yes, what did you try? Well, this is a quick answer because no, I didn't play any solo games prior to starting the podcast. Actually, I would have scoffed at the idea, and I would have thought that it couldn't possibly work, and boy was I ever wrong. And it's kind of a good lesson to myself to not knock something until I've tried it. For me, my first experience with any solo game was through the Iron Realm podcast. And if it wasn't for that podcast and for the pandemic, I never would have gotten into it. And when I did start Tale of the Manticore, I didn't even know about the existence of various products that would help you play solo, or that there was a vibrant solo community out there. And I didn't learn about the mythic GME until several months into making the show, when I discovered the incredible Me, Myself, and I YouTube channel. Of course, now that I have fully embraced solo play, I actually find it to be, in many ways, or at least in different ways, richer than a table game. Thanks very much for your question. The next one comes from Ernest Klontz. Ernest asks, where are you coming up with the story? Is it just kind of winged, or do you have an idea of how the actual story is going to go, even if a PC dies? That's a great question. I'll talk about the last part first. If a PC dies, I certainly feel it in all of the ways that you would at a table game. You sort of bond with your characters, even if you're playing multiple characters. And certainly the longer that I live with them, the more I bond with them and genuinely stress over the chance of their dying. But I do think it's very important to have that chance. There's got to be stakes, otherwise, at least for me, the excitement is gone. In the case of a TPK, even that is something that I would embrace. It's not something that I would hope for, but as long as I keep the mindset that the main character is the world or the main character is the story, I think you can roll with any eventuality. In the case of a TPK, you could turn that into a prologue if it happens early enough in the story, and then the main story starts after that. And hopefully you connect that TPK or use it as a springboard to your next story. If a TPK happened mid-season or late season, I think that would be much tougher to deal with, and luckily I haven't had to deal with that. But I guess the process would be kind of the same. You would have a story that was in two halves, almost as if it were two mini campaigns or two mini arcs. In terms of where I'm coming up with the story, for the first, say, dozen episodes, I'm just making stuff up. Completely at random. Often it's the first thing that comes into my head. Quite often, I have a second idea that is better than that first idea. So if I move through it slowly enough, that tends to produce the better ideas. After around that 10 episode mark, something magical happens because there are enough elements in your story, and you know enough about the characters in it by then, that the story just begins to write itself. It's a little hard to explain, but it really is true that once there is a momentum to your plot and direction for the characters, then there's a certain causality that starts to occur where the way things go is almost the way they have to go. And then you add in the dice, and that's kind of the engine. There's inevitable causality and random chaos through the dice gods. Actually, that's still what I find so exciting about this mode of storytelling. I'll finish up by saying that in season 1, I think it was about episode 50, when I kind of knew where the story was going to go ultimately. In that season, I knew that once that horn was blown, and I didn't expect the villain to blow the horn until it was actually happening. But once that did happen, and I understood, this is summoning a dragon back to get its revenge. As soon as that happened, I kind of knew, well, eventually this story ends with a climactic mountaintop battle with the dragon. And how the characters get there and which of the characters make it there. Those I didn't know and didn't want to know. But I kind of did have that final scene in mind. With Season 2, I kind of had an idea, even from the beginning, that there would be these 3 demons and that they would have to be dealt with eventually in the ruin under the castle. And that's kind of all I knew about it. Basically, I just wanted to do the opposite of what I'd done in Season 1, and instead of a mountaintop battle with a dragon, I thought I would go down and have an ultimate battle at the end of a dungeon crawl. But again, I didn't know how they were going to get there, or who would get there, or what complications would arise between A and Z. Now that I'm starting Season 3, I'm in the anything goes stage, where I'm really just getting to know my characters, and although I have sort of come up with an initial mission, I have no idea what the end game will be. And that's okay, actually. I'm happy to be living on the ultimate edge of the story as it moves forward, without knowing what happens next. It feels a little dangerous, and it feels exciting. My third question is from Samuel Marconi. Samuel asks a really interesting question. He wants to know if the villains in Tale of the Manticore could earn their villainhood a little bit more. What if the villains could be under the influence of the dice more, or even maybe as much as player characters? He points out that a lot of the villains are protected by some kind of plot armor until they do come face-to-face with the PCs. That's true. They absolutely have been protected by plot armor in the past. And I have kind of kept them as separate from the player characters in the sense that they're more a part of the fabric of the story. So could it work? I think it could work. An idea that was kind of rolling around in my head in Season 2 was that NPCs and PCs were starting to lose their distinction. And I was beginning to question if those terms even had value. Part of me thought that I would abandon those terms entirely when I got into writing Season 3, but now that I have started writing Season 3, I do find that I'm coming back to those terms. So, will NPCs suffer the dice? I think that that's a definite maybe. I won't know until I get there. Certainly not every NPC, because with minor NPCs I think that might just slow things down too much, but with a major villain, I think that could be interesting. Just on a final note, Samuel, I would say that your question is a great example of how this kind of fiction is still developing and experimental and very hackable. So I could imagine a show where they do exactly that. Everybody, PCs, NPCs, good guys, bad guys, is subject to the will of the dice. Thanks for that question. The next one comes from Thomas Murgy. Thomas writes, I play solo sometimes, but I have some difficulties to render my story, and he means like through writing or making a podcast or a video. To be short, do you have some tips to describe the action using a few sentences? This is a tough one for me because I don't play any solo games outside of Tale of the Manticore, so I don't have any experience, and I probably don't have any good advice specifically on shortcuts to bookkeeping. For me, essentially it's like writing a novel, but with dice. I can imagine a situation similar to what Steve Morrison of Errant Adventures does, where he talks into the microphone and he's playing and doing his bookkeeping and everything live at the mic. So I could see if you were to make an audio recording of yourself, not for publication, but for your records, I could see that working. And I do think it's important to have records. And probably this is the part of the question that I can add some value to. You do want to have some record of the game because all of the little details that you throw out, almost as an aside, some NPC, some Chekhov's gun, those are the things that come back later in ways that surprise you, and you can almost hear an audible click when some old idea comes back into play in a way that you never expected it to. For those that have finished Season 2, there's an event in the finale where that exact thing happens, and it's a really cool thing when that occurs. In terms of making your writing and creative life a bit easier, I do have a couple of suggestions for that. One, I would say always move the plot. So every session that you sit down, or every section of the story, for me it's episodes, but for a personal game it may not quite be organized that way. But whatever section of the story that you're telling, always move the plot, because passages of just character development or passages of just description are great, but if it's too much, I think it can drag. I make Tale of the Manticore with an audience in mind, so I'm always thinking about pacing and variety. But I think those same principles would apply to a personal game and make it a better one. Secondly, I would say if you can, end your sessions on some kind of cliffhanger or unresolved event. This will have a couple of good effects. One, it'll make you want to come back to the game. And secondly, when you do come back to the game, you'll find that you can just jump in with the wind at your back and true momentum. If you end on a clean resolution, then you might find that the car stalls a little bit when you come back to that game and you're not sure what to do next. With a cliffhanger, you always know what's next, and you're always looking forward to it. Thanks for that great question. The next one comes from Ryan Christopherson. Ryan asks, how do you keep the story moving and still have a few surprises for yourself as the player? And can you have a cohesive story without having it planned out beforehand? So I spoke to that first question in my last answer a little bit, but in terms of surprises, my all-time favorite, and I haven't used it on the show enough, and I'm going to rectify that in Season 3, is Tana Pigeon's mythic GM Emulators Event Meaning Tables. It's a pair of tables that essentially have a verb and a noun, and you'll roll randomly against each of these tables, you get a combination of words, and then you try to interpret them. And this is a way that you can surprise yourself with your own creativity. It's that whole idea of if you have too many choices, you can experience a kind of paralysis. But if you are very limited in your choices, then you're forced to get creative with what's at hand. Your second question is, can you have a cohesive story without having it planned out beforehand? A very good question. Yes and no. And I guess it depends on your definition of story. So if you're looking for that 3-act structure where you have a character and they have a problem, and then that problem is complicated many times, and finally that problem is resolved, you can force that. I think you'll end up using some degree of DM fiat to make that happen. And the more cohesive that you want it to be, maybe the more DM fiat you'll have to inject into the story. Maybe this harkens back to the question about the NPCs. And I think if you were to say roll dice for NPCs and villains, you would be trading off some of that cohesive story for something different. But that something different isn't necessarily bad. It just becomes an alternative to traditional storytelling. So if you can divorce yourself from the idea that the good guys have to win, or that the characters from the beginning of the story must survive to the end of the story, or that all characters who enter the story must play a pivotal role in the story. If you can let some of those things go, then I think what you're getting is something that's closer to a tabletop game and further away from a novel. So the answer to the question is, you can definitely do it, but I think you have to decide where on the spectrum between novel and game you want to be. I feel personally like I'm somewhere around 60% novel and 40% game. I suppose that's up for debate, but I do think that that is a choice that you have to make, and probably that ultimately comes down to your taste. The next question comes from Psychic Machinery. Psychic Machinery asks, I'm having a hard time locating a lot of the stuff mentioned in the podcast. Has it gone into the internet ether, or is there somewhere to find it? I post quite a bit of stuff on taleofthemanticore.blogspot.com, and for some of it, you would have to keep scrolling down and clicking that older posts link to get to it. I don't post everything on the blog for sure. Shortly after Season 1, I started to collect lore items and mechanics items, things like that, and put them into a collection that I called Encyclopedia Manticorica, which you can get for free on DriveThruRPG. And incidentally, right after I finish recording this Mailbag episode, my next task is to update that file with information from Season 2. So those are really the two places, the blog and Encyclopedia Manticorica. The next letter is from Del Tiegler. Del writes, I have a quick question about audio mixing. Which software do you use? And can you recommend a basic setup that won't break the bank? Absolutely, Del. I'm a bit of a gearhead and I love this stuff. In a nutshell, you need two things. You need a microphone and you need a DAW, also known as a digital audio workstation. The best, cheapest one is Audacity. Audacity is free, it works on any platform, it's been around forever, and it's great. Before I was into podcasting, I actually used Audacity for a few years to record music. As for a microphone, the best bang for the buck is probably the Blue Snowball mic. You've probably seen this one before, as it's very distinct looking. It looks like, well, a snowball. It's about the size of a grapefruit, and it's either white or I think they make them in black now. Anyway, it's a USB mic. It sounds good. I actually used that microphone on a very recent video I did on YouTube, where I played through the top level of One Shot in the Dark. And since we're talking about it, there's something about that video I could point out if you are shopping for a microphone. When I did all the editing, I actually had to redo the outro, but I decided to do a little experiment and just use my cell phone's microphone for the outro and see if it made any difference. And yeah, it makes a big difference, it turns out. So if you're curious, you can check out that YouTube video. It's the recent one where you can see a top-down view, and the audio that you hear for the first 90%, that is the snowball mic. When you get to the last introduction, where I'm in front of that yellow background, that's just the cell phone mic, and you can clearly hear the difference when you A/B them that way. Anyway, I got into the weeds there a little bit. I'll get back on track. Blue Snowball mic and Audacity. That's the basic setup. I think in general for microphones, if you are looking at south of 40 or 50 bucks, well, buyer beware. I think you might be getting a kind of very cheap mic in a decent looking package. I would stick with trusted brand names as well. Oh, one other little hack that's absolutely worth knowing. If you do have an inexpensive setup, you can make your own pop screen, which is going to save you all kinds of headaches in the edit. Look that up on the internet and you'll find all kinds of ways to do that. Anyway, I hope I didn't witter on too much on that one. The next one comes from RC, and this is a very different kind of question because it's about the story itself. RC asks, why didn't Catsbane set the pixie free? RC is referring to Season 2, Episode 18, I believe, where in a dramatis personae, where Catsbane is working as an apprentice to Carrick Malmar, and there is a weeping pixie that kind of drives him crazy with its incessant crying. I think my first inclination would have been for Catsbane to release the pixie, especially as he had to escape himself, and there would be nothing really to lose. And I think I decided not to, mostly as a way to give dimension to Catsbane's character. I didn't want him to be too much of a goody two-shoes. At the time, I thought it would be more interesting if I characterized him as having a little sliver of hardness inside. Earlier in this Mailbag episode, I talked about how you should record small details, and that as you make the story, you just create all kinds of small details through small decisions. This would be one of those. And by the end of Season 2, that decision to give Catsbane just the hint of a mean streak really paid off in the narrative, and I think made the resolution of the entire season make sense. So you can call it a happy accident that I made that decision at the time. I'm certainly glad I did. Oh, and as an aside, you're not the only one to ask that question, RC, because Kyellen, who voices the character Catsbane, asked me that exact same thing. Question 9 comes from Eric of Dragonspire Gaming. Eric writes, I wanted to ask where you're getting the inspiration for Chartoon's parables. Eric brings up a couple of these that resonated with him. In the absence of experience, I disappear. I believe that was from the parable of the blackness of mulberries. And there's another line that he quotes from Shawnee, who says, I think wisdom and good feeling keep little company in this life. Every now and then, Shawnee does uncharacteristically show some wisdom. So to answer the question, how do I get the ideas for the parables? So basically, if I find my characters in a predicament, especially a moral predicament, but not always, I find that I can reinforce the thematic element of that struggle by constructing a dramatis personae, whether that be a flashback or one of Chartoon's parables. So these mini-stories are reverse engineered from the problem and might present a hint of a solution, or they might just kind of add some other layer to the problem itself. And if there's an opportunity for me to inject a little bit of irony there, I definitely take that chance. In the one that Eric mentions, in the absence of experience, I disappear. I kind of plucked that from my experience teaching senior level philosophy. So anybody who's familiar with David Hume might have recognized that empirical idea. If that's something that's interesting to you, the branch of philosophy I'm talking about is called epistemology. That second quote that Shawnee said, I think wisdom and good feeling keep little company in this life. That also comes from my experience as a high school teacher. Most of the time, I teach English Lit. So that is a paraphrase from the character Bottom from a Shakespeare play called A Midsummer Night's Dream, one that I have been alluding to fairly continuously throughout the creation of this season. So the actual quote is that reason and love keep little company these days, meaning they don't get along or are incompatible. But I love that turn of phrase so much, I thought I would give it to Shawnee and change reason and love to wisdom and good feeling. The next question is from Christopher. Christopher says, I'm curious, when it comes to character backstories, do you roll on a chart or something like that to determine inspiration for the backstory, or do you come up with that on your own? Thanks for that great question, Christopher. So I don't use any kind of tables to determine backstories. Usually the first thing I'll do is roll up stats using my method of ignoring anything 5 or under. And then I'll look at those stats to get a very, very general sense of what the person is like. Often I'm looking at intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, those kind of mental stats. So those give me some kind of direction, but it's really not until the characters are faced with conflict when I start to figure out who they really are, just based on the decisions that they make. I might decide that a character with a low wisdom score is a little bit reckless. That's what I did with Shawnee, where I decided that she would have this motto of live for today because you never know if you're going to be around tomorrow. So after those kind of initial traits have been decided upon, then I can use dramatis personae and flashbacks, things like that, to reinforce those ideas. Why are they a little bit reckless? Did they have any experiences in their early life that made them that way? And the same could be said for a character who was prudent or studious or had difficulty relating with other people. So the stats are a starting place, and then the backstories kind of reinforce the why. Since we're talking about characters and their traits, I think it's really interesting to take a character like Shawnee, who did have a low wisdom score, and so I did decide that she would be reckless, and then give that character a bit of an arc. So with Shawnee, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if over the course of the season that she could start to change, and specifically if she could be influenced by another character. So in this case, it was Tamlin who kind of influenced her and sparked that curiosity about wisdom in her. Question 11 is from Anonymous, because actually I've received this question quite a bit. The question is, did you know that you're pronouncing dramatis personae incorrectly? And the answer is kind of, yeah, I kind of did. I can remember 4 years ago, in one of the very first episodes, I was happily writing away the script, and I wasn't even thinking about it until it came time to record. And then I came up against this term that, as an English teacher, I've seen that before, but I wasn't 100% sure how to pronounce it. So I ended up looking online, as I often do for things like this, and I found both pronunciations out there, dramatis personae and dramatis personae. And eventually, I think I found something from Cambridge University that said dramatis personae, and so I went with that. At the end of the day, I know that this is probably nails on a chalkboard for somebody who knows the correct way to pronounce it, but English is kind of like that. It's famously full of loan words from other languages, which then get their pronunciation mangled, and then that new pronunciation just becomes English. What's off the top of my head, a word like mountain would have originally been montagne from the French, but eventually that gets corrupted and mispronounced enough times that mountain, and then even mountain, becomes the new way to pronounce it correctly. Question number 12 is the last question in this mailbag, and it's another anonymous question because it's another one that I have gotten quite a bit. And that question is, will there be a Tale of the Manticore novel? The short answer is, not for a while. The longer answer is, I almost started doing a season 1 novelization, really starting to experiment with how that would look last summer. My feeling was that it would be extremely quick and easy to do. The transcripts already existed, and that it would really just be a matter of re-editing and reformatting and figuring out how to get that into a EPUB file format. But as I started making it, I realized a couple of things. One, it was really difficult to format and still keep the same kind of energy, especially where dice rolls were considered. To just have the number appear in text, something was lost. And I experimented with a couple of different ideas for that, and I never really found a way that was completely satisfying. Another thing I realized is that even though the scripts existed already, they would take a lot of work. At the end, I did a 5-chapter sample, and I sent it out to a couple of close friends and asked for their feedback. And they were all gracious and gave great feedback. And at the end of the day, I thought, I'm not quite ready to do this. And despite being asked about it many times, I wasn't sure that there was enough of a market out there for it to justify the probably couple hundred of hours of work that it would take to do. That said, I still really like the idea, and one day it might happen. But I think doing it concurrently with a season 3 might just be too much work for me right now. So, who knows? Maybe after season 3, if I need a real change and a real break from making audio, that's something I'll revisit. Anyway, that is it for the mailbag. If you stuck around this far, thank you so much. Thanks for all your great questions, people that write to me. I love getting your emails. It really just gives me incredible joy and inspires me. From people that write in with questions to people that just write in to say that they're enjoying the show, thank you so much. I am grateful. Anyway, thanks for listening. If everything goes to plan, the next thing that you hear will be a mini-series. 4 parts, 2 players, no GM, semi-actual play in cooperation with Steve Morrison of Errant Adventures. So watch out for that, because it's coming soon. Until then, let chaos roll.